Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Natasha Allen. I am the Director of Training for the Michigan Works Association, and we are excited that you have joined us for the Reasonable Accommodations webinar, What You Need to Know, in honor of National Disability Employment Awareness Month. A few items before we get started. Please be sure to mute yourselves. You'll notice that closed captioning is available, so I believe Gary's going to go over how to turn that on in case you don't know, but it is available for you. If you have folks that are with you in the room that didn't register for the training, that's completely fine. But we want to know that they're attending so that we can keep an accurate attendance account. So if you can go ahead and put that in the chat for us, we'll make sure that we record that. Please feel free to ask questions during the training via the chat box. We will be addressing the questions during the presentation, so don't save them until the end. And I will pose the questions on behalf of the group to the trainers. The survey will be sent at the end of the training via email, and I will put that in the chat as well. It's only going to take a couple minutes to fill out, so please make sure that you do that for us. That feedback goes back to the trainers to help them in future trainings. We do have some upcoming trainings that I want to highlight. Our Community Listens is a communications training that is probably the best communications training that I have ever attended. I attended it about 5 or 6 years ago, and I still use the skills that I learned in that training today. So I would encourage you to register for that. You do not have to be a Michigan Works agency to do that. That training is open to anyone, including members and non-members of the Michigan Works Association. It is in Gaylord on November 29th through December 1st. We do need you to sign up by November 5th because there is some pre-work that has to be done for that class. And trust me, you will not regret taking the time out for this training. I'll also be able, I will also put that link in the chat as well so that you're able to access it. We are continuing to add to our event and training calendar, so make sure that you subscribe to the newsletter. If you go to our website, you'll be able to find it at the bottom of the page. All of those trainings that are on there, please be sure to look at them. Even if you're not a Michigan Works agency or employee, those trainings are open to you as well, and we would encourage you to attend. If you have any suggestions for training opportunities, don't hesitate to send them my way. Now I would like to introduce you to your trainers. So Renée Lyon is the on-site occupational therapist at Michigan Career and Technical Institute. Her professional interests focus on accommodation and support for transition youth participating in training and employment, and providing support to local companies during the hiring or retention process of employment. One fun fact about Renée is that she is the mom of a very spoiled French bulldog named Prue. We should have had you post a picture, Renée, because I'm sure that we would have liked to have seen Prue. One of your other presenters, Gary Holik, is a business relations consultant with the Business Network Division, Michigan Rehabilitation Services. His professional interests focus on labor market information, disability advocacy and awareness, assistive technology, and workplace accommodations. A fun fact about Gary is that he teaches computer classes to older adults, and he calls it a hobby. So he thinks it's fun. Thanks for doing that, Gary, and giving back. And then Nikki Fliearman is the on-site occupational therapy assistant at the Michigan Career and Technical Institute. Her role at MCTI includes providing accommodation support to transition youth participating in training and employment. And a fun fact about Nikki is that she spends her summer season camping at Michigan campgrounds with friends and family. I can relate to that. I also enjoy doing that during the summer. So you have to take advantage of our Michigan summers for sure. We look forward to hearing and learning from all of you, and I want to turn it over to our trainers.
Thank you, Natasha. Again, my name is Gary Holik, and I want to give a shout out to Craig Saunders. He's a business relations consultant on our team as well, and he was part of the presentation team. So shout out to Craig. So just some more housekeeping. Just keep in mind, we're using technology. Technology is wonderful most of the time, but sometimes it can be a struggle. So just exercise patience if we have some issues. We know that the microphones and video are muted. Closed captioning is available by selecting the CC closed caption button and then show subtitles. So please use that if you need to. If you have any issues with Zoom, contact Zoom for technical assistance via the Zoom Help Center. So looking at our objectives for today, we're going to talk about what are reasonable accommodations, when are reasonable accommodations required, who is responsible for providing those reasonable accommodations. We're going to look at some case examples to see how the processes work, and we're going to talk about resources to help you move forward. So now I'm going to turn it over to Nikki to get us started.
Thanks, Gary. So according to the Department of Labor, a job accommodation is an adjustment to a job or work environment. And actually, if you can hit to the next slide, please. There we go. Okay. It's a job accommodation is an adjustment, or oh my gosh, yes, is an adjustment to a job or work environment that makes it possible for an individual with a disability to perform their job duties. Accommodations may include specialized equipment, modifications to the work environment, adjustments to work schedules or work responsibilities. And please be aware that not all people with disabilities, or even all people with the same disability, need the same accommodation. And then also note that businesses of 15 or more employees are legally bound to provide reasonable accommodations. Next slide, please. So under Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act, reasonable accommodations include adjustments to the job application process. So a qualified applicant with a disability can be considered for a position. Modifications to the physical work environment or to the way a job is usually performed. So an individual with a disability can perform the essential functions of that position. And changes that enable an employee with a disability to enjoy equal benefits and privileges of employment like those that are enjoyed by other employees without disabilities. This can include access to trainings, cafeterias, lounges, auditoriums, and company-provided transportation. And next, Gary will tell us about the accommodation process.
Thank you, Nikki. So we look at a situation where we have an employee. This is an employee that we value very much. They're highly skilled and they're motivated, and you don't want to lose them. You want them to continue to work for your company because of their skill set and how they help your company be successful. So they come to you asking for an accommodation. And we could think of this, or you could think of this as a simple process of discovery. And we like to break it down into 5 steps. So the first step is the request. So when you have somebody that comes to you, they request that accommodation. It's much easier if the business already has a reasonable accommodation request process in place. A lot of businesses don't, so this makes it more difficult for them. But if they have a process in place, it makes it a lot simpler. And this process should be shared with all employees. It should be something you review periodically, something you review when you hire people and onboard people, but something you might want to talk to them about, maybe every year when you do the review. It's also something that you should commonly look to update. So always make sure that accommodation process makes sense for your business. Once the request for an accommodation has been made, the business must engage in the interactive process. That's really important. So that's simply an ongoing conversation between the two parties, the employer and employee, to help understand what barrier or barriers the person is experiencing and the why. It is also an opportunity to discuss what solutions might be available to assist the person. We ought to remember, because accommodations are individualized, they're significant to that employee. The employee is the expert on what might or might not work for them. The second step is to acquire medical documentation. However, this is only necessary if the need for the accommodation is not obvious. That's really important to remember. Sometimes businesses get really bogged down by that accommodation piece, or I mean, that documentation piece. If someone uses a wheelchair, for instance, do we really need documentation saying that they have paraplegia or quadriplegia? Probably not. Let's just look for ways to help them out. Reasonable documentation means that the employer may require only the documentation that is needed to establish that the person has an ADA covered disability and the disability necessitates a reasonable accommodation. Employees are not required to repeatedly provide medical documentation or information about an ongoing condition year after year. Access the accommodation options. This may be a situation where you'll want to bring in some outside experts, such as Michigan Rehabilitation Services. During this step, the parties are evaluating which accommodations might be helpful for the employee. Both the employer and the employee are important participants in this process. Again, keep in mind, the employee often knows what accommodations will work best because they know the barriers presented by their disability. The employer, however, is familiar with the systems, policies, and practices in place within the organization. And in the end, it is the employer who decides what accommodation is put into place, but it must be effective in resolving the functional limitations provided by the disability. Select and implement. Once the employer identifies an effective accommodation, a plan should be made to put it into effect on the job, including the timeframes, such as when we're going to start and when we're going to look at, is it working? If an employer plans to deny an accommodation request, they should have a prepared reason documented for denying the request so they can give it to the employee. Measure effectiveness. There should be a plan for follow-up to determine the effectiveness of the accommodation. The effectiveness of the accommodation can change due to changes in the job or tasks required on the job, technology, policies, and the disability. Ongoing communication should continue throughout this whole process. That's the interactive process, to determine if the accommodations are working and to make adjustments accordingly. The whole process should be documented in order to maintain an accurate record of the process and the steps that were taken to assist the employee. We want to make sure we're careful that we don't implement unwritten accommodations. That could be something that could cause issues down the road. So always make sure, even if it's a minor conversation with an employee about a potential accommodation, we are documenting that process. Now, Nikki is going to talk about some accommodation examples.
Okay, so keep in mind what I said earlier about not all people with disabilities or even the same disability need the same accommodation. Accommodations should be personalized to the individual's specific needs according to the essential functions of the job. Accommodations may be providing assistive technology like a modified keyboard, mouse, headset, or using speech-to-text technology. It could be adjusting tests or training materials so that the information can be read aloud or completed in a quiet space. Acquiring or modifying equipment like swapping out round doorknobs for handled ones, like the one in the picture for individuals with grip challenges. It could be modified work schedule, like part-time hours, having a later start time, or modified break times. It could also be job restructuring, like eliminating tasks or swapping tasks with another employee. And then next, we'll be taking a poll on whether some accommodation examples are reasonable or not. Next slide, please. Okay, So a poll should be popping up for you to answer if this is a reasonable accommodation. If this looks like a reasonable accommodation. I'm not sure the last time I saw a horse walking through Target. Okay, so let's look at the poll here. 4% yes, 96% no. So most of us agree that this looks like an unreasonable accommodation. And actually, this is kind of a trick question. So legally, a mini horse is a service animal that is protected under the ADA, just like a service dog. The only breed of horse, the mini horse, is a service animal. But the one in the picture is not a mini horse. So this example is considered to be unreasonable as an accommodation. Next slide, please. Okay, so here we have an employee requesting that their employer, which is a mom and pop diner, to install an elevator to access the basement supply room. So would that be a reasonable accommodation? Putting in an elevator to access the basement supply room. And it looks like it's an older building where, you know, that would be quite a expensive request by an employee as well, to give you a hint. All right, the results. So 45% said yes, 55% said no. So really it would be considered unreasonable because this business, it's a small mom and pop diner. It's only 1 story. I know we're talking about the basement, but the business could have another employee bring up supplies from the basement and swapping out some of those job duties depending on what the essential functions of the job are for that employee. Or they could also stock a lower quantity of supplies on the first floor to allow the employee to still assist in restocking supplies, but not bringing up large quantities from the basement storage area. And an elevator would be quite a costly, unreasonable accommodation in this place. Next slide, please. All right, reasonable or not. So the employer is working with their employee to provide accessible transportation. And the employee wants this beautiful gray Chevy pickup truck on the left, and the employer is looking more at the minivan. So would the employee requesting this beautiful truck be a reasonable accommodation request? I mean, that's a tough choice, truck or minivan, you know? Can't blame someone for trying. So is it reasonable to want the pickup truck? All right, the results. So yes, 12%, no, 88%. So this was a real life case. And an employee actually up in the UP needed a work vehicle and they requested the truck instead of the minivan due to the weather challenges and I think a little bit of personal preference there. The employer concluded that they would pay for the minivan, or if the employee wanted the truck, that they would cover the cost they would have paid towards the minivan toward the truck. So then the employee would be responsible for the rest of that bill. All right, so next Gary has some mostly painless true or false pop quizzes for you next.
Thank you, Nikki. So this could be true or false question. A business is required to consider reducing productivity or quality of work requirements as a reasonable accommodation. True or false? Looking for those results. Did those come up yet? Oh, they're there. Okay. All right. So 13% of you thought it was true. 87% thought it was false. So this answer would be false. And I want to keep in mind that the ADA does not require businesses to reduce or eliminate quality or quantity of work expectations. However, businesses may choose to do so. If they choose to do so, it would be strongly encouraged to document the rationale and timeframes. So there could be a situation where they're bringing someone back to work after a period of time off. This could have been due to a disability. And a business may choose to have reduced productivity expectations. However, that could be maybe because they're trying to build up their stamina again. Okay, so they might choose to do so to help the person get back up to where they want them to be. But it should probably be, the time frame should be documented, it probably should be limited time frame, and it should be fully documented, the rationale of why they're doing so. Next, true or false question. An employer must eliminate another employee's position to accommodate an individual with a disability if another position is not available. True or false? Okay, 3% thought it was true, 97% thought it was false, and the answer is false. The business does not have to eliminate another employee's position in order to accommodate an employee with a disability. All right, so now Nikki is going to talk about unreasonable accommodations.
Okay, so the employer generally does not have to provide an accommodation unless an individual with a disability has asked for one. Once an accommodation is made or the request is made, the employer must engage in the interactive process. So once they have asked, then the employer can't just say, no, thanks. They have to engage in that interactive process with the employee. Where more than one accommodation would work, an employer has the right to choose the one that is less costly or easier to provide. So just like that example I gave with the pickup truck and the minivan, the employer had the right to choose and say, no, we're not going to do the truck. We'll pay for the minivan. And they were kind enough to say, you know, we'll put towards the truck the amount that we would have paid towards the minivan. An employer is required to make a reasonable accommodation to the known disability of a qualified applicant or employee, as long as it doesn't impose an undue hardship on the operation of the business. So just like that other example I gave about the mom and pop diner, that the employer, if it's an undue hardship and that small diner to put in, say, a $10,000 or more elevator, they can choose to say that's an undue hardship. And that's where Gary talks about making sure that they're documenting why, if that is the case. It's very important. An employer is not required to lower quality or production standards to make an accommodation or eliminate essential functions of the job to accommodate an employee. either. And next slide, Renee is going to talk about a case study for us.
Thank you, Nikki. All right, I am going to talk about this first case example, and this is about a student that we worked with at MCTI. However, it was during the pandemic, so this was all done virtually. This individual had diagnoses of, what were they? Klippel-Ternani syndrome. And this is a rare congenital vascular disorder in which a limb may be affected by port wine stains, by varicose veins, and or too much bone and soft tissue growth. The limb may be longer, shorter, and or warmer than what is typical. This is not a picture of Steve's actual hand, but it's an example of what it's very similar to what his hand looked like. He actually had 2 fingers and 1 thumb on his left hand. Due to the syndrome, he did not have a right arm. He was born with a right arm, but it was non-functional, and so it was amputated when he was an infant. He also had his left lower extremity amputated for the same reason. And he had additional diagnoses of a phantom limb syndrome, so the pain and sensations as if his limb was still there, and major depressive disorder and generalized anxiety disorder. He, after going to college and being unable to secure internships at all, because employers looked at him with, 1 arm and prosthetic leg, saying, nope, you're not going to be able to do anything for us. After some downtime working through that with his MRS counselor, he decided that he wanted to learn to become a pharmacy technician. Well, next slide. A pharmacy technician, they do a lot of duties that require typically 2 arms. So keep scrolling forward. Listed here are going to be some of the essential job functions for a pharmacy technician. Things like mixing the pharmaceuticals, the preparations, data entry, counting pills, filling bottles. I'm sure each of you have visited a pharmacy at some point, and so have seen the technicians and the pharmacists working behind the counter. Typically, the tasks use 2 hands and require standing for an extended period of time. Because of his diagnosis and the prosthetic leg, he had some standing limitations, and it was not something that he would be able to build further endurance. It was directly related to the syndrome versus his stump getting used to using the prosthesis. So as you can probably imagine, Steve had several functional challenges for the essential job tasks of a pharmacy technician, student, and then eventual employee. They included things like counting the pills, opening and closing the tamper-resistant medication lids, affixing the prescription labels to make sure that they are square on the prescription bottle, not all cockeyed, standing for extended periods of time. The work of a pharmacy technician, they do all of their work standing. Heavy lifting may be involved if the pharmacy fills IV solutions. They might, when product is delivered, that stuff needs to be put away, and as a technician, that's one of their responsibilities. And reaching supplies either stored very high, above shoulder, above head, or on very low shelf. Those were all types of responsibilities for a pharmacy technician that may be a challenge for him. So next slide. The following are, I'm going to talk about the accommodations and strategies that we recommended and implemented with success. First, using a left-handed counting tray to manually fill prescription orders. The trays come in right and left-handed. He actually already had a right-handed one at home that he was using. He was just turning it upside down. So he had already made his own accommodation, but they do make left-handed ones and sent that to him and it did work better. So he was able to count the pills on the counting tray using his left hand. We sent Dysum to him, which is kind of, you can see it at the bottom of that picture, that blue stuff. And it's also at the, they're using it to open the lid. But we use that to help stabilize the bottle, the prescription bottles and the bulk medication bottles so that he could open them with one hand. He was initially kind of bracing them against his chest to open them. And according to pharmacy standards, that was technically okay. I mean, you can't put it under your arm. You can't use your mouth to help out. You don't put it between your knees to open it. So he was technically within standards. But if he were able to open it on the counter, the working counter, it would be more acceptable. And if people see him doing that versus opening it on his chest, they're going to feel more comfortable, the customers, and that's important. So he also used the Dysum to open and close the prescription bottles and the bulk medication bottles. He also used the Dysum once he filled the medication bottle and closed the lid, he would put it on its side and put the label on the bottle that way when it was laying on its side. And he was actually able to square the label up very easily, much better than when he was trying again to do that on his chest. We use something called a standing stool, which is something that you lean against, partially sit on, but it keeps you at standing height or at counter height and takes about 80% of the weight off of your legs. And actually, this is a common accommodation or a common tool that you'll find in pharmacies. They don't take up a lot of space and it keeps people at the right height. Oftentimes, they're actually used for, like, if one of the pharmacists or a technician becomes pregnant and is having a hard time standing towards the end of the pregnancy, things like that is very common. We talked about heavier deliveries and him being able to pick things up with one hand. And a couple ways that he could manage that were, one, cutting a handle into the box to be able to pick it up one-handed, so he had something to grab onto. And the other was to actually open up the box and pull the things out one at a time. And his balance was sufficient that allowed him to use good ergonomics to be safe to reach both the floor, to squat down, and to use a step stool to reach things that were out of his reach or above head or overhead. So Steve was recommended some things to do. He was recommended to practice using all of those strategies I talked about a little bit ago, or just a moment ago, to improve his ability to complete the essential job functions and to work on improving the productivity rate. That has been mentioned a couple times already, as far as employers expecting quality and quantity or productivity work, and they don't need to settle for less. And so Steve knew that he needed to be able to fill 10 to 15 prescriptions in a given time frame. That's about 30 minutes. So basically filling a prescription, about one prescription every 2 minutes. And that includes not only filling the bottle, but also the data entry, printing out the label, things like that. So he worked quite a bit with that. And he was always able to contact us or his MRS counselor with any type of assistance regarding the challenges that he had. In conclusion, you know, will Steve be successful? Well, now I can talk about it because he was and he is. Would he be able to fill the same role as an fully able-bodied person? Would he be able to secure integrated employment? Yes, yes, and yes. But we had authentic conversations prior to him starting pharmacy training, all through the training, and as he was finishing the training. He's very well aware that he has what we call a visible disability. So as soon as he walks in, they're going to question if he can do the job that is typically done with somebody with 2 fully functioning hands. And he's already experienced doors being shut in his face when he was earlier from college trying to secure his internships. So he was all very well aware of this and was ready for it. And we had practice conversations and how he would reply. What else do I want to say about that? He ended up being hired by a local pharmacy, and they purchased the sit stand for him. He brought his Dyson with him. It's something that you can use and use and use, and he has done extremely well. So, yay, it works. We do truly, or let me say, success isn't just about what you accomplish in your life. It's about what you inspire others to do. And we do truly believe that success is also about what you inspire others to do. I'm going to talk to you about a different case. And the
Renee,
company, yep,
real quick, Natasha has some questions for us. From
I'm sorry.
That's okay. Thank you.
No worries. I didn't even say anything yet. So as I was listening to some of the things that you guys said before, a couple of things popped in my head in regards to employers and what they might come across. So are employers required to have an official written accommodation process or policy? And if so, do you have any examples that you might be willing to share so that they have something to go off of if they have no experience with it?
So they're not required by law, but we strongly recommend they have a reasonable accommodation process in place. And yes, we can share with them examples. Something we do within the Business Network division is we can consult on developing those processes for your company. So they're unique to your company.
So how would they get in touch with you, Gary? What does that look like?
At the very end, we will have our contact information. So they can just reach out to me and then I can connect them to a consultant that covers their area.
Great. And you talked about documentation of the reasonable accommodation process. Would an email chain be sufficient documentation or should it be more official?
It's something you want to be able to put in a personnel manual. So it should be more official. I think as long as it's documented, obviously you can print off those emails and put them into the personnel file as well. But we want to make sure that the process is documented in case there's any issues or concerns down the road about he said, she said, or they were going to do this and they didn't. That's why it's important to have those documented.
Okay. And those wouldn't require necessarily signatures or anything like that from both parties. I mean, I'm going from email, which is pretty informal, to super formal, but as an employer, what would I need to do to protect myself and the employee?
So it's not going to require signatures. I've had situations before where I've worked with businesses where the interactive process was initiated and one party didn't want to participate, the employee. So then the employer just kept documenting everything that they would do to try to keep that process moving along, to try to initiate the conversations about reasonable accommodations. So it doesn't have to be signed, just you're documenting what you're doing. So again, in case it comes back later on to a he said, she said thing.
Right. Okay. And then one more, because I think you're going to answer my fourth one that I had later on, but can you provide some of examples besides the ones that are here, like maybe that are a little bit closer and not as easy to figure out of accommodations that would constitute undue hardship for employers? I mean, it's pretty easy to see, you know, that some of the ones that you guys provided weren't, but what are some ones that are maybe on the fence, and how would you look at, you know, who would decide the undue hardship and how would you maybe document that?
Renee, jump in if you have some thoughts. In my experience in conversations with other experts, if you want to call it that, it's really hard to justify an unreasonable accommodation in a lot of situations. If one of the ways you might look at unreasonable accommodation could be a cost factor. So if the accommodation is a significant cost to the business based on what the business makes per year, then that could substantiate an unreasonable accommodation. The truck issue that Nikki had highlighted, that definitely could be an unreasonable accommodation. So I think every situation, so when I work with businesses, I just try to have conversations with them about the whole process, and then provide them my thoughts on whether or not it could be unreasonable. But I can't really think of any situation where an accommodation wasn't implemented because of unreasonableness in my experience.
Yeah, Gary, I agree. It's hard to come up with an example of something that is unreasonable. If it is putting undue hardship on other employees, that is not reasonable. If it potentially causes harm to others, and I'm thinking manufacturing, that's not reasonable. And then we look at accommodations and the levels of accommodations. You have very simple, basic, and you have high technology. And there's a gamut that may work for whatever the specific barrier is. And, you know, if I want a piece of equipment, then I'm probably going to want what's new, the latest and greatest, but the business doesn't have to purchase that for me if something a few years old or simpler does the same thing. So it's kind of like, I used to say Yugo and Cadillac, and now some of the people I work with don't know what Yugos are. So a Chevy and you know, a Tesla. So it doesn't have to be the Tesla, and the worker doesn't have to be happy about that. It is just about getting the work done. It's leveling the playing field for them so that they can still do what needs to be done.
And Craig, I had mentioned Craig earlier. He wanted to be involved in the presentation. So he pointed out that any request to just remove an essential function from the job would be considered unreasonable. So that would give you an example of unreasonable accommodation. And then just keep in mind too, I think the point is that you know, the business gets to choose what makes sense for them. So an example that I've had with a business recently was they had reached out because the employee was working 50 hours a week, and he brought in a doctor's excuse that because of back issues, the doctor wanted him working 40 hours a week. So the accommodation discussion was around working 5 8-hour days, 40 hours a week, or 4 10-hour days. Of course, the employee wanted the 4 10-hour days because that gave him a 3-day weekend, right? But the business said, we need you here 5 days a week. So the business wanted to know which one they had to go with. because the employee was adamant he wanted to do the 410s. But again, the business gets to choose what works best for them if both accommodations are equal and accomplish the same thing. So the businesses get to make that choice.
Great. Thank you both so much. It does. Thank you.
Right.
All right, I will continue with the second case study. The company in this story is an inspiration to us. I was hugely moved and can be used as a model of true inclusion. They had not employed someone with the characteristics of this MRS client before. They did not have a specific plan or example to follow. They determined this client was a good fit as far as she was able to do the work that they wanted and she was motivated to do it. The interactive process was used, meaning they talked about everything. You don't have to go further. And they had an engineer on staff and they were able to figure a lot of things out. The company, if you want to go back just a minute, Gary, was Thermatron. And every product from every company that, products that we buy, they must work in the real world. I know my iPhone has been tested as far as water and shock and drop and all that stuff. Same with the Android phones. They must stand up. Thermatron, what they do is they make the test cubes or test chambers that all of these products are tested in. They have, I think it's 36 service centers in the US, and they have actually 36 countries. They are in 36 countries around the world. Now next, the client, Becky, you see her right there. She's a little person standing at 3 feet 11 inches tall. She graduated from high school and earned her diploma. She has chronic lung disease and has had surgery to repair curvature in her spine. She has some physical restrictions in lifting, no more than 20 pounds. Well, she doesn't weigh more than, 85, so that makes sense. She has some limitations in reaching and bending because of her back. And she also has some safety concerns due to the limitations of her reach. Her dwarfism, she is proportionate, meaning her torso is not significantly longer than what her arms and legs are. So she's pretty, not 100%, but pretty proportionate. And so if she needs to reach something on the far side of a table saw or a workbench, she's not going to be able to reach it with just her arms. She's going to use her body also. And when you put your body on the same place that a table saw is, that can lead to problems. So go ahead and go to the next. All right. So the Thermatron staff had custom made a lot of things for her before I was ever called in. And it included, they purchased a smaller drill press and built a custom stand for it. So it was all her size, her height. Her workbench had been custom made also to fit her height. They had already purchased a task chair, so something for her to sit in when sitting was, reasonable for part of the essential functions of her job. And they had purchased multiple step stools, so she could use those to reach things that were out of her reach. When I got there, there were only a few things that really needed to be adjusted. The step stools were wonderful, but she was having to pick them up to move them around. They had 3 or 4, but it really needed to be at about 5 or 6 different places. And so putting casters on them was a recommendation, and they did. Very simple actually to do, especially with what they do as a whole. She has small feet and she is standing on concrete. If you've ever worked in a factory in manufacturing or anywhere, automotive stands on concrete too, you understand that standing on concrete is one of the worst things for your feet and body. And they made DuraShock boots, and now there's more or other ones, but to help compensate for the lack of give in the cement. They don't make DuraShocks, or at least I couldn't find any in size child 3.5. They do make youth inserts that are specific for standing on cement. So I recommended that those get purchased. They had purchased a small task chair. It fit her. She did not like it. So we just looked at some other things or how to make adjustments with it to make it more comfortable. And the final thing, which is the lowest picture, the bandsaw, for her to reach that to cut the copper tube. She was soldering or brazing copper tubes into certain specs for those testing chambers. She couldn't reach it, not safely and smoothly, basically. So I had the engineer come on over because I knew exactly what I wanted it to do. I didn't know how to do that. But basically, instead of the picture showing the bandsaw fully open and that arm swings down to cut is how it's used. He put a block in it, so it was at a 45-degree angle instead of a 90-degree angle. And that's where it started and made it fully accessible for her and did not impede the other 4 workers that are working and using that same piece of equipment in her area. So it's important that the accommodations that they made, again, amazing company. I want their engineer in my back pocket, but everything they did was specific for her, and it was a trial and error before I got on site, and it will continue to be. But it also did not interfere with those working around her, didn't interfere with her peers. So the support and adaptation that Thermatron has shown this hire and her intrinsic motivation, she was just amazing. And skill set will likely prove greatly beneficial for her future. So in the eternal words of Tim Buck 3, the future's so bright, I gotta wear shades. All right, now I think I turn it over to Gary.
Thank you, Renee. Natasha, do we have any more questions?
I do not see any in the chat, but again, if you have questions, please feel free to send those in the chat. You can direct message them to me or send them out to everyone, and we'll make sure that they get asked.
Thank you. So the next gentleman we're going to talk about, so a number of years ago, we had a manufacturing company reach out. This manufacturing company is in northern mid-Michigan area, and they were requesting assistance with a return to work situation. They had an employee who had been off for approximately a year after having his left leg amputated below his left knee, and this was due to diabetes. He had went through 3 prosthetics in a period of time of rehab, participating in physical therapy, and they had cleared him to return to work with his prosthesis. And he was told that he should stand as tolerated, sit as needed, and lift no more than 40 pounds. Now, as I said, this was a return to work situation. Sometimes businesses aren't real sure how to handle that. And this business had the original ask was they wanted me to give them permission to bring him back to work. And I said, that's not my role. If he's released to come back to work, then the business has to figure out how is that possible and how they could do that. So the business network division, we have occupational therapists on staff, and occupational therapists came up from Lansing, and we went out to the business and did a work site evaluation and return to work assessment for the purpose of identifying potential accommodations that would allow him to continue to perform the essential functions of the job. And he was a welder. I think I forgot to mention that. So the recommendations included a gradual return to work, such as 4 hours a day the first week, 6-hour days the second week, 8-hour days the third week. And this would allow the employee to gradually build up his work tolerance and to adjust to walking around a building, which was also all cement floors, and standing on concrete flooring with his prosthetic. It was also suggested he return to work at the easier workstations for the first few weeks of work before doing a full day at the more difficult workstations. It was also recommended that he use an ergonomic chair or stool wherever possible. This would allow him to change his positions throughout the workday. And also use anti-fatigue mats at stations that allow them. So the business already had anti-fatigue mats at different workstations, and the business chose to buy the ergonomic chair for the employee. We also recommended that if he had to lift more than 40 pounds, that they use a crane, or there's other material lift type equipment that allows people to lift heavy equipment or heavy materials. We also suggested that if that wasn't available to him at certain workstations, that he use a two-person lift to assist him. And we also recommended that he participate in training to be a certified TIG 2 welder. He was currently a TIG 1 welder, since the physical demands are less than a TIG 1 welder. And the station where you perform TIG 2 welding, you can do that while sitting. So the employee has now been back to work for about 5 years. He did train to be a TIG 2 level welder, so he's able to sit while he welds. He was promoted up within the company, and the business is happy, the employee is happy, and it's a win-win for everybody.
Hey, Gary, we do have a question that was submitted. It's actually kind of twofold. So it says, does the team have any guidance on how to address other employees that may be resentful regarding the company providing an accommodation to another employee? And how to answer if they ask questions about the other person's accommodations?
So that's a tough one, I think, for HR, right? But really by law, it's confidential, right? Conversations you have with your employee, that individual employee that might be requesting accommodation for any medical purpose, that's all confidential information. So I think as it's a delicate, how do you navigate that world of saying it's somebody to somebody it's none of their business, right? Like, I know it's tough from my experience, but that's how I would answer that. You have to be confidential, and it's not their business as to why you're being provided accommodation. Sometimes when accommodations are provided for employees, the business figures out that accommodation might be something that might work for other people, not necessarily because they're currently having issues, but maybe it helps them in the long run to have a more healthier workforce. For instance, in the past, you might be provided a sit-stand stool because your doctor said you have to have that option to be sitting and standing because of back issues. And then some businesses have figured out that sit-stand options for other employees that may not be reporting issues right now are beneficial in the long run for a healthier workforce. So I think you just have to have that difficult conversation. It's not their business. Renee, I don't know if you have any.
No, I was going to say it's the same way you would handle any other HR issue. If somebody, has to all of a sudden go on an unexpected leave because somebody passed or medical emergency or whatever, and they didn't want that shared, it doesn't get shared. And so, I mean, it's kind of the same. It does get stickier because, once there's something new, when sit-stand stations first came out in offices, everybody wanted one, and that was an issue. And each company just kind of handles it.
Yeah, would it be possible? I mean, a lot of people don't know about reasonable accommodations or why we have them. is it something, Gary, that, or anybody on the MRS team, that you might be willing to come into a business and have like an in-service or a conversation with those employees if the employer were to host you, to kind of
Absolutely.
do groundwork for that, so that they know what a reason, it's not favoritism, right? It's not
Yeah.
any of those types of things, right? It's a reasonable accommodation and required by law. So,
Absolutely. Yeah.
okay. So
We
I
could
think
definitely
that,
do that.
yeah, and your contact information will be at the end of the slide, and you'll be able to, even if you're not in their area, direct them to the correct representative for that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Two slides. It's coming up.
Great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Okay, so here's our commercial. The Business Network Division, that's who Renee, Nikki, I, and Craig all work for. And we're part of state of Michigan. We're part of an agency called Michigan Rehabilitation Services, which is part of an agency called Labor and Economic Opportunity. And that'll be on the quiz at the end. And we cover the whole state of Michigan. And we are composed of occupational therapists, occupational safety advisors, licensed and nationally certified rehabilitation counselors, certified business solutions professionals. And we also work very closely with our sister agency, which is the Bureau for Services for Blind Persons. And they are experts in vision people that have issues with vision or are legally blind, and they have rehabilitation therapists on staff to help assist with situations as well. So here's our resources slide. This is not all encompassing. There are more resources out there, but these are some of the resources that can help you as a business try to navigate that world of disability and reasonable accommodation. Of course, there's Michigan Rehabilitation Services, that's us. The Job Accommodation Network is a very good resource for accommodations, but I want you to always keep in mind is that an accommodation is individualized. So the Job Accommodation Network might give you some guidance or provide you some guidance, but we don't want to just pick a disability and pick an accommodation for a disability because we read about it on JAM. We want to keep in mind that the person with a disability is the expert on what accommodations might work for them. And then we also want to keep in mind, that everybody's individualized and that we might want to tap into other resources as well. Workforce GPS, Great Lakes ADA Center, Great Lakes Bay ADA Center is also a very good resource as well. So this is a good spot for questions and answers. Anybody else wants to throw some questions into the chat area?
I don't see any in the chat, but if anyone wanted to unmute and go ahead and ask, we'll give you a few seconds to do that.
While we're waiting, I can hop out of the next screen and you guys can see there's our contact information. So keep in mind that our role as Business Network Division is to help you businesses be successful and help you navigate that world of disability, ADA, and reasonable accommodations. So reach out anytime you have any questions. I get emails from businesses all the time. Hey, Gary, what do you think about this situation? And if I don't know, I'm going to connect you with somebody who does. I'm going to connect you with our occupational therapist, or I might connect you with outside parties as well. So I'm going to help you figure things out. That's all our roles.
And I can vouch for that. In my prior position, before I came to the Michigan Works Association, I worked for a local Michigan Works agency, and our business solutions professionals would reach out to Gary and Craig often on behalf of businesses and to connect businesses with them to help with accommodations and training and just questions. They're a safe place to ask questions so that you know what you need to do to best help your employees, because that's what we're here to do, right? We want to make sure that people have what they need in order to do their job well. So they're a great resource. I would encourage you to reach out to them, to consider windmills training. I know that they do some of that. That's also an opportunity. And we had them come through and do a walkthrough of our service center to make sure that we were accessible to all people with disabilities. And that was also a great thing that they did for us as well. So just some things to keep in mind going forward. MRS is a really great resource for businesses and Michigan Works agencies. So thank you so much for joining us today for the training. Thank you to our presenters for helping us to better understand reasonable accommodations and for being so open and willing to share. We really appreciate that. Don't forget to fill out the survey in the chat. Put it in the chat for you. It'll also come in your follow-up email, and we hope that you have a wonderful day.